Well, this is a question that's plagued historians ever since the end of the Second World War.
What if your last name was a crime? They were born into palaces of power, raised in homes where history was written in blood, and then left to navigate a world that saw them as heirs to evil. The children of the Third Reich didn't choose their fathers, Himmler, Goering, Mengele, Goebbels, but they inherited their sins. Some fled, changing their names and starting anew. Others fought back, publicly condemning the monsters who raised them. A few doubled down, defending their fathers' legacies with a loyalty that bordered on fanaticism. This is the story of what it means to be born into a nightmare, and the impossible choices that follow. The inheritance of silence. They grew up in houses stripped bare by history. The curtains were still drawn, the floors are still polished, but something had vanished. Something invisible and heavy, the certainty that they belonged. These were not ordinary childhoods. There were no schoolyard games free of whispers. No friendships are untouched by suspicion. For the sons and daughters of the Third Reich, growing up meant learning how to exist with a name that arrived in every room before they did. Many of them said nothing. Not for lack of words, but because silence became the safest choice. In post-war Germany, admitting who your father had been could shatter a life. So they became shadows in classrooms, neighbors with locked eyes, workers who smiled but never spoke of family. The war had ended, but for them it had only changed form. It wasn't tanks and sirens anymore. It was a job not offered. Invitations were never sent. A quiet exile in the very place they called home. Some tried to disappear entirely, changing surnames, fleeing cities, creating new identities in faraway countries. Others stayed and built a life in the ruins, hoping time would soften what blood had stained. But time did not forget, and neither did history. Some clung to pride, who insisted their fathers were misunderstood men, soldiers doing their duty, bureaucrats who had no choice. They raised glasses at secret reunions. They told stories the world no longer wanted to hear. And then there were the few who broke the silence, who stood before cameras and crowds and said, "I know who he was, and I will not defend him." For them, the past wasn't just inherited. It was dissected, exposed, and carried like a cross. What united all of them wasn't belief or guilt, but the weight of a name spoken in hushed tones, the weight of a face seen in textbooks, the weight of being remembered, not for what they did, but for who they came from. They were not criminals, but they were born inside the wreckage of a crime so vast, even birth became a kind of sentence. Ursula Dönitz, a daughter in uniformed shadows. Ursula Dönitz didn't grow up in a palace, but her life was ruled by order, by rank, by quiet fear. She was born into a naval family, disciplined, precise, and emotionally distant. Her father, Karl Dönitz, was a man of the sea, a U-boat commander, and eventually, for a brief, strange moment, the head of Nazi Germany after Hitler's death. To Ursula, he wasn't a symbol, he was her father, a man who demanded respect but rarely offered warmth. Their life moved with the tides of war, base to base, city to city, always in the shadow of a uniform. At just 20, Ursula married another man in uniform, Günther Hessler, a respected U-boat commander and her father's trusted ally. Their bond was built not on politics but on duty, on shared silences, on understanding the rhythm of war. They had 3 children. She waited through endless patrols, never knowing if her husband would return. 2 of her brothers didn't. One lost at sea, one was killed on the Eastern Front. She absorbed their grief like an anchor. Her mother, fragile in her way, leaned on her. And Karl Dönitz, the admiral, the war leader, sat in silence that only Ursula could sometimes break. She never considered herself political. To her, war was not ideology. It was family. It was an absence, loss, tension that lived in the bones. She believed her father was a man of honor, a soldier who followed orders. When Hitler died and her father took the reins of a crumbling empire, she didn't question it. In her eyes, he was the only one left with any discipline. After the war, while her father stood trial at Nuremberg, Ursula stood outside the courtroom. She listened to reports on the radio. She read his name in the papers. 10 years in prison. She was relieved. It could have been worse, but she never believed it was fair. She visited him when she could, behind glass, through bars. Once, she simply told him, "I like you," and that was enough. Years later, when he returned home, she cared for him until the end. Quietly, without speeches, without shame. Ursula never denied the Reich, but she never embraced it either. She chose something else, loyalty, without ideology. A daughter, not a disciple, a woman living in the long shadow of a uniformed father, and refusing to let that shadow define her completely. Edda Goering, the last Reich princess. She was born into silk sheets and golden cribs, into a world where soldiers bowed to her, and her father ruled the skies. Edda Goering was the daughter of Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe, second only to Hitler. From the moment she arrived, her life was a performance, a symbol, the Reich's golden child. She grew up at Karinhall, a palace built from looted wealth and tribute. There were tigers and ponies in the garden, paintings stolen from across Europe hanging on the walls, and in the nursery, a godfather named Adolf. She was told she was special, chosen, and for a while, she believed it. Edda never went to school. She was taught by private tutors, dressed like a doll, and photographed beside men who would one day hang. Her father adored her, called her his golden treasure, and gave her castles, miniatures, and medals. She was the perfect Aryan daughter, until the Reich fell apart. In 1945, at just 7 years old, her world ended. The palace was abandoned. Her father was captured. Her mother and she were taken to a camp for Nazi wives and children. The cold seeped in. The food vanished. The guards didn't bow. She never saw Karinhall again. Then her father killed himself days before his execution. Left her a letter written in blue ink, telling her to stay strong, to believe in him, to reject the lies of the victors. She did. Even as the world learned what Goering had done, his theft, his cruelty, the camps, Edda held on to that version of him. The man who read her bedtime stories, who kissed her forehead, who told her she was his greatest pride. She never changed her name, never apologized, never made speeches, but she lived in the shadow of that letter. She stayed loyal. In her later years, she asked for the return of family possessions, paintings, heirlooms, and things taken by the Allies. She said it was legal, nothing more. But to many, it was something deeper, a quiet claim to a life that should have been erased. Edda Goering died in 2018, alone. No monument, no apology, just a grave, a name, and a silence that said more than any confession ever could. Rolf Mengele, the ghost and the father.
I could never understand human being can act like this, and
He was a boy when the whispers began, a name spoken in schools, in newspapers, in courtrooms, a name that made teachers pause, that made classmates stare. Rolf Mengele. He didn't know who his father was, not at first. They told him his father was a doctor, a war veteran, a patriot, someone wronged by history. Auschwitz wasn't mentioned. The ramp, the twins, the scalpel, all of that was missing. In its place was silence, but silence can't last forever. Rolf was born in 1944 in the last breath of a dying regime. Joseph Mengele had already begun his descent into myth and terror, the man in the white coat who decided with a gesture who lived and who died. When the Reich collapsed, Mengele vanished, disappeared into the smoke and rubble, leaving behind only shadows and a sun. As Rolf grew, the stories caught up to him. The name that once meant protection now burned. At school, he found it in history books. At home, it was met with stony silence. His mother avoided questions. The family closed ranks, but the truth was everywhere. In 1977, he made a decision, one that would change him forever. He traveled to Brazil. His father, hidden for decades, was living under an alias, protected by sympathizers. Rolf knocked on a door in the jungle and came face to face with a ghost, his father. Old, bitter, unrepentant. They spoke for days. Josef denied nothing, regretted nothing, claimed he had been a scientist, that the children were sacrifices for progress, that the world didn't understand. Rolf listened, he didn't believe it, and when he returned to Germany, he made a choice to keep his father's secret, not out of approval, but out of confusion, out of love, out of something even he couldn't fully explain.
Shortly before Joseph Mengele's death in 1979.
When Josef died in 1979, drowning on a beach in Brazil, Rolf confirmed the body, gave a DNA sample. The last chapter closed, but the name remained. In interviews, Rolf condemned his father's crimes, spoke of shame, of disgust, but also of the weight of blood, of being the son of someone the world had named a monster. He didn't run from the truth, but he never escaped it either. Rolf Mengele lived not in denial, but in the impossible space between love and horror. A son staring into history and trying not to disappear inside it. Harold Quandt, the surviving heir of Magda Goebbels. When Berlin fell, so did his family. Magda Goebbels, wife of the Nazi propaganda minister, poisoned her 6 children in the bunker beneath Hitler's shattered empire. She believed a world without National Socialism wasn't worth living in, but one child survived, and Harold Quandt. He was not Joseph Goebbels' son. He was the child of Magda's first marriage, born into wealth and conservative privilege long before she stood beside Hitler. As war raged and his half-siblings became symbols of Aryan purity, Harold was far away, serving in the Luftwaffe, flying missions, a soldier with no idea what awaited in the ruins of Berlin. He was a prisoner of war when the news reached him. His mother, his stepfather, his brothers and sisters, all gone, dead by cyanide and bullets. Magda had written him a farewell letter. She spoke of sacrifice, of purity, of not wanting to live in a defeated world. She made her death sound like duty. Harold never publicly spoke of that letter, but he kept it. After the war, while the world was burying Nazis and rebuilding nations, Harold returned to something different: money. His biological father, Günther Quandt, was one of Germany's most powerful industrialists. Despite producing weapons for the Reich and using forced labor, he was never charged at Nuremberg, a fellow traveler. They called him passive, peripheral. He kept his empire. When Günther died in 1954, Harold and his half-brother inherited it all: factories, patents, and stakes in major companies, including BMW. Harold didn't talk about the war, he didn't talk about Magda, he didn't write memoirs, he built, he managed, he made millions. While his mother was remembered for poisoning her children, he quietly helped rebuild the German economy. But silence has a cost. It wasn't until decades later that the Quandt family's use of slave labor came to light. Public pressure forced the heirs to fund historical research. The truth was ugly, profits soaked in blood. And Harold, he had benefited, even if he were young, even if he said nothing. Harold Quandt died in a plane crash in 1967. His name, his wealth, and his silence outlived him. He was the only Goebbels child to survive, but survival, in his case, meant walking through a life of luxury while the ghosts of the bunker stood just behind the door, silent, waiting, watching.
Now first, like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously with the reach of this video. Thank you.
The Eichmann children. Between denial and confrontation. They lived in the quiet suburbs of Buenos Aires behind white fences and Spanish-tiled roofs. To the neighbors, they were just another German family, private, distant, unremarkable. But behind the front door, the truth hummed like a low electric current. Their father was Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the trains, the bureaucrat of death, the man who organized the logistics of the final solution, who made genocide efficient. His children called him Papa. Klaus Eichmann, the eldest, was raised on myths. His father wasn't a criminal, he was a soldier, a patriot, betrayed by the world. That's what the family told itself. And Klaus believed it. He joined local neo-Nazi circles, spoke with pride of the Reich, defend his father in interviews, even after the trial, even after the world had seen the documents, the testimonies, the horror. And strangely, Klaus believed that led to his father's capture. He bragged about his identity to the wrong person. Sylvia Hermann, a German Jewish girl whose father had survived the camps. She told Mossad. The rest is history. Adolf Eichmann was taken from a street in Buenos Aires, smuggled out in the dark, and tried in Jerusalem.
The Mossad agents thought there's no way that Eichmann, a lieutenant colonel in the SS.
His trial was broadcast to the world. His children watched their father become a symbol of evil in real time. The younger brothers reacted differently. Horst and Dieter vanished from public view, changed their names, moved, avoided questions, avoiding each other. They were raised in the same house, but they chose silence. Then there was Ricardo, the youngest, born in Argentina, too young to know the Reich, but old enough to feel its shadow. He chose another path. As an adult, Ricardo read the transcripts, the survivor stories, the documents, and he understood. He didn't defend, he didn't deny, he spoke. "My father was a criminal," he said, "and I have to live with that."
He became an archaeologist, quiet, scholarly, precise. He never changed his name, but he changed the story.
The Eichmann family split like a mirror dropped on concrete. Some shards pointed backward, toward pride. Others turned forward, toward truth. Not all of them chose guilt, but only one chose to confront it. Gudrun Himmler, the daughter who stayed loyal. To the men in black uniforms, she was the princess of the Reich. To the world that came after, she was a woman frozen in time, unable or unwilling to let go. Gudrun Himmler was the daughter of Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, architect of the Holocaust, and one of the most feared names in Nazi Germany. But to her, he was simply Papi. She adored him, worshipped him, and he returned that devotion with letters, gifts, and carefully crafted lies. As a child, she accompanied him to official functions, smiled at the camera while her father shook hands with killers. He once took her to a concentration camp, Dachau, not to teach her horror, but to show off order. She saw the uniforms, the dogs, the cold concrete, but not the blood. When the Reich collapsed, Gudrun was 16. Her father was captured by the Allies and committed suicide with cyanide before he could be tried. She never saw him again. The world moved on, but she did not. Gudrun refused to change her name, refused to denounce her father, refused even to consider the possibility that he had been anything other than a patriot betrayed by history. She lived her life as a quiet warrior for the old cause, not in public speeches or books, but in phone calls, secret meetings, and legal funds. She became a central figure in Stille Hilfe, Silent Help, a shadow organization that offered support to former SS officers and Nazi war criminals still hiding from justice. When Rudolf Hess died, she was there at his funeral. When neo-Nazi groups held quiet commemorations, she attended, always in black, always with a stern face, a living relic. She worked briefly as a secretary, married, I had children, but the cause, her father's memory, was her true calling. She wrote letters to judges, raised money for convicted Nazis, denied the Holocaust not with words, but with silence so loud it swallowed truth. Gudrun Himmler died in 2018. Her grave is discreet, no fanfare, no flags. But her legacy lingers not in history books, but in the spaces where truth is quietly rewritten. She wasn't a criminal, but she chose to protect them. She wasn't a soldier, but she stayed loyal to the war. And in the end, she became the last living echo of her father's iron will, unbending, unbroken, and untouched by remorse. Martin Bormann, Jr., from Crown Prince to Catholic, priest. He was baptized with Hitler's hand over his crib. They called him the Crown Prince, Martin Adolf Bormann Jr., named after his father, Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary and one of the darkest architects of the regime's inner circle. His childhood unfolded in the heart of power, the Eagle's Nest, the Berghof, gardens where Nazi leaders laughed and toasted while the world outside burned. But inside those walls, Martin Jr. wasn't just a symbol. He was a boy trying to survive the pressure of a name that had already chosen his future. His father was distant, severe, known for slapping him in front of others when he saluted incorrectly. That slap never left him. It wasn't just pain, it was a prophecy. He realized even then that his father's love came with rules too twisted to follow. When the war ended, he was 15. His world collapsed overnight. He wandered through Bavaria under a false name, hiding among farmers and strangers. For the first time, he heard what the regime had done, what his father had done. It broke something in him. A priest took him in, taught him compassion, grace, doubt. He converted to Catholicism, studied theology, and became a missionary. He fled not just from Germany, but from his blood. In Congo, he was taken hostage by rebels, tortured, mock-executed, but he survived and he stayed to serve, to try, in his quiet way, to do something good. But the past followed. When his father's remains were finally identified in the 1970s, his skull unearthed from the ruins of Berlin, Martin Jr. was forced to confront that ghost again. The man who vanished into rubble had left a son who still lived in his shadow. He later married a former nun, renounced his priesthood, and became a teacher. His life was full of contradictions. A man of faith born in the house of death, a seeker of peace raised by the hands of power. In old age, he was accused of abuse by a former student. The case never went to trial, but it added another shadow. Martin Bormann Jr. never denied the past, but he never escaped it. He walked a road of repentance paved with silence, and whether it was enough, no one can say. He died not as a prince nor a priest, but as a man who tried to become something his father could never be: human. Wolf Rudiger Hess, the loyal son. Wolf Rudiger Hess spent his life chasing the shadow of a father who never returned. At just 3 years old, his world changed forever when Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, flew solo to Scotland in 1941, attempting a secret peace mission. The Third Reich disowned him, Britain imprisoned him, and Wolf was left behind, holding a name no one wanted to speak. As he grew older, Wolf refused to let his father fade into history as a traitor or a madman. He became Rudolf's fiercest defender. When his father died in Spandau prison in 1987,
Spandau Prison, West Berlin. For the last 28 years, Rudolf Hess has lived behind these walls.
Allegedly by suicide, Wolf publicly claimed it was murder. He believed British intelligence had silenced him to protect wartime secrets. He wrote books, spoke at rallies, founded the Rudolf Hess Society. In every appearance, he presented his father as a man of peace, misunderstood and wronged. He never acknowledged the Holocaust, never admitted complicity. His mission wasn't truth, it was loyalty. Wolf denied being a neo-Nazi, but his associations said otherwise. Even his son, Wolf Andreas, was later convicted for Holocaust denial. Still, Wolf stood by his father until the end. He died in 2001, still convinced the world had lied about Rudolf Hess. In his silence on atrocities and devotion to a myth, he chose not history, but legacy, one built on belief, not facts. Nicholas Frank, the son who fought his father's ghost. Nicholas Frank was born in 1939, the son of Hans Frank, Hitler's lawyer, and the man appointed Governor-General of occupied Poland. While his father orchestrated the legal framework of genocide, Nicholas played in castles, unaware of the crimes being committed under the flag that flew above him. But years later, the truth found him, and when it did, he didn't hide. Nicholas became one of the few children of Nazi leaders to condemn his father openly, publicly, and relentlessly. He called him a murderer, a coward, a pathetic figure whose polished speeches masked rotting intentions. His book, Der Vater, eine Abrechnung, The Father, a Reckoning, wasn't just a memoir, it was a personal demolition, a son putting history and his father on trial again. He didn't stop there. In interviews, documentaries, and lectures, he met with Holocaust survivors, spoke to young people, confronted Germany's uneasy memory. While other descendants clung to denial or silence, Nicholas chose confrontation. Brutal, unforgiving, necessary. He said hatred was his survival, that if he didn't hate his father, he would collapse under the weight of what he learned. Nicholas Frank turned his inheritance into a warning. He chose not just to reject his father's crimes, but to make sure no one could forget them, not even himself.
Albert Speer Jr., building redemption, not monuments.
Albert Speer Jr. was born into a house of blueprints and shadows. His father, Albert Speer Sr., had been Hitler's architect, designer of cathedrals to power, mastermind of war production, and a man who claimed, after the fact, that he didn't know about the genocide his buildings stood beside. As a child, Speer Jr. met Hitler, sitting at tables where dreams of a 1,000-year empire were drawn in pencil and ink. But when the war ended and his father was sentenced at Nuremberg, those drawings turned to ash. At 13, he was left with a name that spoke louder than he ever could. Unlike many children of Nazi elites, Albert didn't run from architecture. He embraced it, but redefined it. His buildings weren't monolithic or symbolic. They were human. Cities are planned for light, air, and function. He designed for Shanghai, for Qatar, for post-war Europe, never for glory. He spoke little of his father, but when he did, he didn't excuse him. Nor did he indict him outright. He lived in the in-between, a quiet man in a loud legacy. When he died in 2017, there were no speeches of redemption, just a quiet recognition that sometimes rebuilding doesn't require words, just bricks, and the decision not to repeat what came before. They were born with names that opened doors or closed them forever. They didn't choose those names, but they carried them. Some wore them like armor, others like chains. They were not the architects of atrocity, but they lived in its shadow. Some denied it, some fled, some turned toward it, demanding that history never be forgotten. There is no single path for a child of a war criminal, no easy redemption, no universal guilt, only choices, painful, personal, imperfect. These were the children of the Reich, and long after the bombs stopped falling, their lives became the battlefield where memory and silence still fight.